My original name was Jeremy Kaufman. My mother was Maura Mealy, and my father was Todd Kaufman. I grew up in Long Island. I was born in Rockville Center, New York, raised in Belmore, and then raised in North Amityville. My parents were from the 60s. They were both radicals, coming from left-wing movements. You know, at that time you had the hippies, and then, you know, and other organizations such as the Black Panthers and stuff, but they were from an organization known as the Yippies. You had individuals such as Abby Hoffman, and other, you know, they were connected with the Panthers. They were connected with groups like the Weather Underground, and this is where my parents, you know, they came from. They came from these ideals. My mother and father met about 5 years before I was born. There was a big age gap between the two, but they stayed together up until I was 3 years old. And then my mother had, her and my father had separated, where she met my stepfather, who had raised me along, you know, as my second male figure from when I was 4 years old up until they divorced in 2008. And what made that relationship very unique at the time was this was a biracial relationship. You know, you had, you know, in the early 70s, this was not as acceptable as it was today. At that time, you know, my mother had to deal with the heat from people, be it, you know, her family. Basically, her family disowned her. You know, they did not associate with her. And even so much so, there was word that even like one of my uncles was like after my stepfather. You know, and, you know, at that time, they also dealt with, when they would go out together, they would have to deal with the brunt of, you know, racial discrimination, be it from, you know, white people and also black people as well, because this was frowned upon. This was not liked. You know, however they stuck it out, they dealt with it. You know, they had to do some fighting. You know, and that was my mother and my stepfather. They would, if they had to brawl, they had to step up, they stepped up. And they raised me, and I had a very unique relationship because in that time, my father was born in 1940, and he was probably one of their only proponents that they had in their relationship, believe it or not. You know, he was against racial prejudice, being, as I said before, he was connected to certain left-wing radical groups, and you know, they were against racial discrimination. They were against the Vietnam War. They were against oppression. So he was not like that. So he was one of their only proponents. And so I had two male role models in my life to show me the direction to go and to get the good from them, and also to try to keep away from the bad of them. As I was growing up, we lived in various communities. My mother, my stepfather, and I. We moved from town to town, and a lot of times we faced racial discrimination. I can recall an incident when my mother had told me about, was back, we lived in Babylon Village in Long Island, and the landlord had painted the steps, one side white and one side black. And this was to show, you know, his disdain for this interracial relationship. And then we moved from place to place till we lived in an area called West Islip. And everybody on Long Island knows it as White Islip, a very white enclave of Long Island. You see, one of the worst kept secrets of Long Island is it's a very segregated area. You know, everybody thinks of New York as a very liberal place, very open and so on and so forth, but it's not. There's a lot of segregation. There's a lot of, you know, you don't go into this area because you're this color or that color. But West Islip was one of those towns. So much so that we basically got ran out of that town. And that was in 1978, to where we moved to where my stepfather grew up in North Amityville. And we moved there in 1978 until we moved out there in 1986. And in that time, you know, I was the only white kid in that neighborhood. You know, I was a little scrawny kid, little punk, snot-nosed kid who grew up there. But, you know, I learned, you know, to broaden my horizons and meet different people and get to know different people there. You know, at first when I moved there, people gave me a hassle. They like to mess with me and stuff. And I think it's less because I was white, but more because I was different and the new kid. And so I remember an incident where I would get messed with at the bus stop, and this was in 2nd grade. So I went home crying like I normally did and told my mother. So my stepfather came with me to the bus stop, and after that, when the kids saw who I was, who my family was, they stopped it. It all came to an end. So people knew they started giving me respect in the neighborhood because they knew my family, who I was connected to, because my family was very well known in that area. And so I'd walk around town, everybody knew me, so on and so forth. But one thing that always was kind of funny, there was this one girl in the neighborhood, and when she saw my mother, she liked to drive around on her bike and call us honky. We always thought it was funny because she was a very light-skinned girl, so how we looked at it was, well, she probably caught a lot of grief growing up, but now because there was somebody lighter than her, she thought she could give it to somebody else now. So we thought that was pretty funny. But other than that, there was never any situations in comparison to when we lived in the white neighborhoods. So we became part of that community. We became well known in the community, and like I said, it was a great time to grow up in the late '70s and stuff. The early '80s, it was a different time. Everybody knew everybody respected everybody. I respected my neighbors, they respected me, and that's just how it went. And on the weekends, because my mother and father were separated, he lived in a predominantly white area known as Lindenhurst. So then I got to see the flip side of things, where you see like a whole different attitude, you know what I'm saying? You see how cops treat people differently. You just see just a whole different thing. So I was able to grow up on both sides of the fence and experience things that many people never experienced. In the aspect that my father, in the late '70s, he had a tumor on his foot. And so he didn't do anything with it. So later on he had it removed, but it became to find out it was cancerous. So in 1983, in one of my visits to Florida, like I always do, like basically every year I go to Florida. And this was the thing, because I was very close to my grandparents, and one of the things was to make sure, because my grandfather died in 1982, he said to my grandmother, make sure Jeremy gets down to Florida every year. So in one of my visits to Florida, I got a call to say that my father was going to the hospital and he was going to get his leg amputated because he had cancer. And so when I got back from Florida, I came home to my father with his leg missing from the knee down. And this was shocking to me. And then, after recuperating, he went back to work. So part of me, in the aspect, as I mentioned earlier, as I had two male role models, I see my father getting up in the morning, putting on his prosthetic leg, because my father didn't drive, he'd walk to work, to the train station, get on the train, get off the train, walk about 2 miles, stand all day on his leg, because he did stock work in the supermarket, get done, get back on the train, go home, walk, and have to soak his stomach and deal with doctor visits, so on and so forth. But the thing was, the amputation didn't stop the spread of cancer. So bit by bit, he had to go and stay in a hospice until he succumbed to his cancer in April of 1985. Now, when my father died, I recall the day vividly. It was April 21st, 1985. It was a Sunday. And I was up early because we were preparing later that afternoon to go visit my father. He was in the Bronx at a hospice. And for those who don't know, the Bronx is a further up borough of New York City. So we would drive there, and we got the call and it said that he passed away. Now, I didn't react like most children would react, bawling and so on and so forth. Me and my father were very close, very close. My father, I was his world in a way, because he didn't have no other women in his life after my mother. So I was he'd see girls and stuff, see women, but I was his world. And so we did everything together. Every weekend I go over there, we go to the movies, I saw movies, we get toys, go get comic book, everything. And so he was he really took care of me. And I took advantage of that sometimes. And and I regret that to this day, because he was very loving and caring for me. So I when he died, I really didn't feel that pain. I went through a little bit when I knew he was dying, but I reacted in a different way. So after he died in 1985, I became sort of an angry individual. And so from 1985, I entered ninth grade, and then completed ninth grade in 1986. And then I went down to visit Florida, to visit my family in Florida again. And then I was given a call by my mother that we were moving to Florida. And what this was due to, my stepfather was having a crack addiction. And it was real bad. I wasn't aware of it because it was kind of hidden, but it was bad. And you know, my mother and my stepfather, they were from the 70s and the 80s. They dabbled in all different things. But when crack hit in the 80s, it was like nothing ever before. So my mother was tired of it. She got my sisters, got in a bus, drove down to Florida, and we stayed at my grandmother's house. Basically, we took over the apartment. Sometime later, my stepfather came down to join us. And my mother, I guess in her mindset, thought that this was going to help him by getting away from the environment that he was in New York. However, crack was everywhere. So he was still dealing with that. And you know, as a teenager at the time, I was working, I was going to school, and also I was dealing with a new school environment. So I started the new school in 1986 down in Lantana, Florida, which is in one of the villages or towns in Palm Beach County. And so when I started school, I went to this, I wanted to go to one school because I heard they had a subject that I was taking in New York that was at no other school. However, it was wrong. So when I got to the school, I remember coming into school like my first days and walking into the hallway and seeing it segregated. Now, to give some understanding to this, the school I went to in Long Island, in Copeg High School, it was a very multiracial school. Everybody was there. You had, you know, where I lived in North Amityville, you had, you know, African Americans in North Amityville. You had down in Copeg by the junior high school, you had the Puerto Ricans. Then you had Italians, you had other, you know, white ethnicities, you know, Polish, etc., etc. Everybody went to school together, and usually there was no there was no problems for the most part. There was intermingling amongst the races. However, as I learned things later on in life, it wasn't all nice as I thought it was. But, you know, there was very few to no racial incidences. The only one I can recall in my Copeg years was where a white girl, got supposedly mugged, and it was a black guy, and her brother was on the football team, and there was going to be a whole racial thing. And it was funny, the thing I recall was somebody would ask me, say, Jeremy, man, you know, what side are you going to be on? I said, man, I'm from North Amityville. I said, forget y'all. I said, these are my people right here. So that's where I was from. That's my mentality. So, but when I came to Florida, it was a whole different ballgame. It almost reminded me, now that I think about it later on in life, like a prison. It came in, and you had, like I said, you looked in the hallway. White kids were here, black kids were here, the Latino kids were there. You walked in the lunchroom, the black kids were on. I can recall walking in the lunchroom to all the way to the left. All the black kids were, then all the white kids and all the Latino kids were in that section. We interact in class, we'd interact in sports, but that was it. There wasn't no hanging out after school. There wasn't no, you know, I don't recall any interracial relationships, because you gotta remember something. Florida was just coming out of segregating their schools. This was a new thing. So there was a whole different mentality down there. And so I didn't understand this mentality. Here I was growing up in North Amityville, you know, saying most of my, you know, people I hung out with were all different people, all different quote unquote races. And so, you know, at bit by bit, you know, you have to, unfortunately, you're forced to adapt. You know, at that time I was like what you would call a metalhead. I had long hair, but then I cut it off before high school, and then I started growing it back. I listened to, like, you know, thrash metal, you know, other subgenres of metal. So I was becoming an angry individual, man. This music was angry. It was like, you know, some of it was satanic, some of it was just violent. So it kind of like, it piqued my interest, because I was just at a time in my life that I was just angry. You know, I'm dealing with the death of my father. I'm dealing with my stepfather being a crackhead. I'm dealing with, struggling money-wise, because, quiet is kept. Everybody likes to talk about this glorious time called the Reagan era. It wasn't glorious. For us who grew up in struggle and strife, there was a little bit of food in the refrigerator. There was a little bit of money. Our phone would get cut off. Electricity would get cut off, etc., etc., etc. So this is what we dealt with. My mother was working. My stepfather was on and off with work. I would go and have to work, give a little contribution to the house. So this is what I was dealing with. So I was angry. And then also in that time, I was starting to be also introduced to another type of music. I was already was punk. I was already familiar with punk music, because there was some movies and some music that I heard from, the late 70s and early 80s. But then I was getting more into it because it was very predominant in the school. There was a lot of punks and skinheads and skaters. So that music really got to me because it got political. It got real angry, a lot of aggression, and so it talked to me. It spoke to me. And so that, and then so in 87, I remember, I had my long hair, and then I shaved my head, and then bit by bit, I was just coming more into that wave of music. So I recall it was the summer of 1987. Now, as I said earlier, I used to take my trips every summer from New York to Florida. But in my time living in Florida, I was taking my trips in reverse, from Florida to New York. So in that year, I came up to visit. I stayed with my friends that I grew up with, my best friends at the time. But then during early 87, I had a cousin from my uncle Danny, his son Danny. He lived in New York, and he came down to visit us, me and my other cousin down in Florida. So we hung with him a little bit. He was staying down there for spring break. So when I got back, I made, to New York, I made it a thing that I wanted to come visit him. And so and my cousin was into the whole punk, hardcore, music. Now let me give you a little explanation, a little understanding. Hardcore is a subgenre of punk. It's more aggressive, more fast. It's harder. And so we were sitting in the room, we're talking about this music, and then he's in a band, he sings for a band, so he's playing me a little bit of his band. And I make mention of how he sounds like another band. He's like, no, we don't sound like that. He said, I'm gonna show you what we sound like. So he plays me this other music. I never heard this music before. It was still a little heavy, but a little slower, a little more, I can't, plucky kind of. I can't, that's really, but it wasn't as aggressive and fast and heavy as what the hardcore was. So it kind of really didn't kick it to me. I didn't bite on it yet. And I said, well, who is this? And he said the name Screwdriver. And I said, okay. So it didn't really hit me, but sometimes in life, you hear something or you see something, and maybe at that moment it doesn't get you. But then a month, maybe even a day down the road, month, 2 years, who knows? Say, you know what? There was something about that I liked. And so I remember there was a skinhead kid in my school, and I asked him about the band. And he's like, yeah, Screwdriver, yeah. He didn't tell me about what it was about. So I have interest, so I want to know more about this band. So back in the day, for you youngsters, we didn't have the internet. We're talking 87. So what we had back in the day was record stores. You had the big record stores, like a Sam Goody, or the Wiz, or Record World, this, that, and the third. Then you have the smaller independent record stores. So where I lived in Florida, right down the road, there was a record store. And I went to the guy and I said, excuse me, can you look to see if you can get this band Screwdriver? He sold punk, hardcore, metal, all different kinds of music. He said, all right, I'll see what I can do. Orders a record, calls me in, come pick it up. I get the record, he takes it out of the sleeve, the thing, and I kind of was blown away. Because on this album cover was a full regalia Klansman. Dressed in full regalia, on a horse, with a torch in his hand, lighting the countryside up. And the name of the album was White Rider. So I'm like, whoa, what's this about? I'm kind of blown away about it. So I kind of take the record, have to sneak it home, because I don't want my mother to see this, and put it on the thing. And I turn it on, I'm hearing this record. It's talking about the Klan. It's talking about being in jail for a racial crime. It's talking about the struggle of the white man. It's talking about how the oppression and of the Jews upon the white man, the stealing of jobs by immigrants and black people. At first, this stuff was just like, wow, man, I can't believe this is what I'm hearing. But see, the thing is about any sort of propaganda, if you hear it long enough and you continue to listen to it, it'll start, something will click in you. And so the music was the first thing that got me, because that, like I said, the sound was sort of different, but it resonated. I liked it. You know, it felt, I enjoyed the music. And then next thing you know, you're humming the tune, and then you're singing the song. And so from there on in, it was kind of like my entrance into a white nationalist, mentality. Well, in the aspect of doing anything illegal or something like that, no. See, that was the one thing. For me, it was, I felt at that time, I was trying to find myself, because I was a very confused individual right now. You know, here I am, 16 years old. I'm like, I feel like I got the weight of the world on my shoulders. I feel like, I'm put in a position in life to make, I'm not allowed to be a teenager. I gotta be like where I'm taking care of things, because my stepfather's still struggling with his addiction. He's going through where he's working and we think everything's good. Then the next thing you know, for example, he was working for my cousin's ex-husband doing floor cleaning. Then we get the call that he stole all the equipment and stole his truck. So he's in jail. So we're dealing with all these sort of things. So I don't know if it was a reaction to what I was seeing with my stepfather doing, and so maybe it made me feel a certain way, like, yeah, this is what they're saying and this is what's happening. I don't know. I can't say that. Or I was just saying I'm trying to find myself through my identity, because I believe in life many people have tried to find themselves through their racial identity, be it they're Latino, be it they're African American, be it they're Asian, be it what they're white, whatever. And then we come to realization that we're human beings. So at that point, it was just an exploration into this, like, why can't I be proud to be white? What we were dealing with at that time, and what kind of also some of us were triggered by, was we saw a rise in black nationalism. Because in the late 80s, hip hop changed the whole direction with Public Enemy, with Eric B. and Rakim, with Boogie Down Productions, with all these different groups, man, because they were coming into consciousness. Before that, in hip hop, it really wasn't being discussed. And so there was a rise in consciousness amongst African Americans. So we'd see the African medallions on, we'd see things, people saying Black Power. See, when we heard somebody say Black Power, we're like, wait a minute, man, you're saying Black Power, why can't we say White Power? And then my mother one time explained it to me. It was one time I'm listening to the same band, Screwdriver, and they had a record called White Power. And my mother saw the name, and I said, what I just said to her, I said, Mom, what's the difference with Black Power and White Power? She said, Black Power is talking about all power to the people, to all the people. Whereas White Power is talking about white people are supreme, white people are superior, everybody else is inferior. That's what White Power means. Because this was my mother's consciousness from back in the day. And it was coming to teach me almost 20 years later. So that always stayed in me. But nevertheless, I still listen to these bands. They talked about white unity, they talked about, certain conspiracies and, things about how whites are being, So, I was struggling looking for a job, I was doing this, so it kind of talked to me. And so I listened to it. I listened to it, and I embraced the skinhead, and whereas I became a skinhead. And this was around in '87 or so. And at first I was kind of like, not really into it, but then like I embraced more and more of it, more of the white nationalist brand of being a skinhead. And let me explain something, because it's very important to explain this. What is a skinhead? The original skinheads were from the late 60s in Britain, and they were originally came from the whole Jamaican dancehall scene at that time. So the original skinheads, were not racist, as we see the stereotypical skinhead of today. You see the stereotypical skinhead with the swastikas. He's beating up, attacking black people, going out against immigration, aligning himself with the Ku Klux Klan, wearing swastika, bands, etc., etc. These were not the original skinheads. The original skinheads were a reaction to the hippie movement at that time, so they kept their heads shaved. They were working class. They kept a certain working class look to them. They wore Doc Marten boots, the work boots. They wore Levi's, stay press. They used suspenders, which they call in Britain braces, to, as like a sort of a decoration to their look, and wore, polo shirts, nice button-down shirts. This was their look. But what they did was they intermingled with the Jamaicans in the dance hall. They listened to a lot of early, what they called ska, rocksteady, that type of music. But it wasn't until the mid-70s, when the whole rise of punk in Britain, that then a new breed of skinheads started to come about. And these skinheads were more violent, they were more angry, they became political, they became disenchanted by the British government. They felt that they were giving blacks and the immigrants much more rights over them. They saw their neighborhoods, they thought, being taken over by Pakistanis and other Asian groups. So they started embracing the more nationalistic, white nationalistic fervor that was in line with groups like the National Front, and which later became the BNP. And so they started going in that realm because they became more nihilistic and more hateful. So, but then at that same time, you have the old school skinheads that they didn't look at these ones as real skinheads, because they looked at the real skinheads were into the dance hall, were into the Jamaican ska, and they were anti-racist. So these guys would clash in the streets as well. So that was what the original skinheads to what was transitioned to the the next level of skinhead. And then in America, the skinheads started coming in probably like the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and some of them, it's really hard to tell what was the original skinheads in America, but I can tell you this: there were many skinheads that were anti-racist, but unfortunately there was some that were very racist as well. In various scenes in New York, what we call hardcore scenes, throughout the country, you had, like in New York, was a very diverse scene. In the late 70s, the early 80s was very diverse. You had black people, Latinos, Asians, all in the scene. And there were people that were skinheads, some that were punks, but they all kind of got along. And other scenes in other parts of the country, you had the racist skinheads. But when they would go and venture out into certain cities, they might get their head handed to them and get attacked and get beat down. I could tell you of a story. I wasn't there for this, but it was, told to me back in the summer of '88 when I was coming up to visit New York, that a group of skinheads came to a show in Miami. And in the Miami scene was a multiracial scene, sort of like the New York scene. And there was Cuban skinheads, there was black skinheads and white skinheads. It was a whole group. So basically come from a group of skinheads came out of Tampa, and in certain parts of Florida they were more associated with neo-Nazism and white power. And so this group came to a show, and one decided to go to the front of the stage and take off his shirt, take off his jacket, and he was flashing his Iron Eagle Nazi tattoo. An Iron Eagle is an eagle holding the swastika. So the skinheads down there, from Miami, weren't feeling this. So the bouncers let him in. They let him go for attack. They attacked this guy, stabbed him, and broke a knife into him. So this is how someone dealt with. I had a friend. One day he was playing a band known as White Pride. This band was, their lyrics was far worse than Screwdriver. However, some people say they were a joke band, and some people say they weren't. But nevertheless, their lyrics, their racial, overtones in their lyrics was far worse than Screwdriver. he came to a show blasting on his boombox. There was a kid from another, you know, from the scene, New York scene, who was in a band, who was very anti-racist. He heard this and he punched him in the face, knocked him out, because some people just didn't tolerate this. But, you know, it was kind of funny though, it was kind of weird because certain people, you know, there was always like certain bands, like white power bands that all people listened to though. I had an individual I knew, he was a black skinhead, man. He had the whole Screwdriver collection in his house. And there were other skinheads, like I said, Latino skinheads, and all that. They all listened to this band. Some people, but if you came out publicly with it, some people might catch a beat down. And then the other side, some people just get away with it. But this is how the scene worked. It was kind of, it was very peculiar, man. It all depended. It was like anything tribal. It's who you knew and where you were on the food chain. But like I said, New York had a very diverse scene. You know, Florida had a very diverse scene. So you knew, you know, there was Dominican skinheads, black skinheads in New York, Puerto Rican skinheads, you know, Asian skinheads, white, whatever. You know, so it was a whole array of this. So the whole aspect of skinheads, it has to be, you know, basically in 1988, it kind of got pushed to the forefront, especially the neo-Nazi skinhead, when the whole Geraldo incident happened, where Geraldo had a group of neo-Nazi skinheads on his panel, and in the audience there was some, and then there was some, what they call sharp skins. Sharp meant at that time skinheads against racial prejudice. And then something happened where the son of Tom Metzger, the head of WAR, the White Aryan Resistance, said something to one of the black guests, who was Roy Innis, the head of CORE, I guess it was a Congress of Racial Equality. He called him an Uncle Tom. Roy Innis got up, started choking him. The next thing you know, man, chairs were flying. The chair hit Geraldo right in the nose, busted his nose. From then on in, anybody who looked like a skinhead, you could be a non-racist skinhead or a racist skinhead. You were a mark. So you kind of had to be careful. You had to have your eyes open. So back in 88, 89, we really walked around very carefully. You know, you know, we were very well known. You know, there was reports about us in newspapers, reports about us on the news. It was all over. And so I remember coming up to visit in New York in early 89 with a group of friends of mine. A few of us were skinheads. We broke down on Long Island in a predominantly black neighborhood in Hempstead, New York. And these guys rolled up on us and said, y'all skinheads? And we were like, nah, not us. Because we knew we were gonna get it, man. We were gonna get it. Even if we weren't racist or whatever, we were gonna get it. So this was the stigma that we had to deal with afterwards. And you know, because you know, you had skinheads everywhere. They were on Oprah, they were on, up here in New York, the Morton Downey Jr. show, on Phil Donahue. Any talk show there was, skinheads was a hot commodity. But the thing was, the real story of where the skinheads came from were not really discussed. So this was me at that time, from 87 to about 1990. But once I graduated high school, you know, I come back to New York. I moved back after graduation, about 10 days afterwards, to move on my own. I was supposed to be going into the Marines in October of 1989. I was living from house to house, place to place. But bit by bit, when I got back to New York, got back to my home, got back to my true surroundings, all that white nationalism, all that feeling of, you know, the white man is oppressed and stuff, and it started to dissipate because I was coming into a new mindset. I was just trying to find myself. I felt there was nothing wrong with be proud to be white. You know, at that time you had certain magazines, you know, which came from what? You had Ebony, you had Jet, you had BET just came about, Black Entertainment Television. So all we kept thinking of is like, man, if they have that, why can't I have this? Not realizing everything is already there. You don't need a magazine called Ivory. You got People magazine. You don't need white entertainment television. You got NBC. You got ABC. You got this, that, and the third. You don't need black entertainment television. You got MTV. MTV from the early 80s never played any black music. They didn't play it took time to get Michael Jackson and all that stuff. So initially, all this stuff was just, you know, propaganda that just, you know, you're told this stuff and you start to believe it. I remember, you know, in one of my instances before moving back to New York, we were at a club, me and a friend of mine, and we met a guy that was a part of an organization. Now, I can't remember his name in particular. However, I knew he was affiliated with the American Front. The American Front was one of the premier, you know, white supremacist skinhead groups at that time. And, you know, some of their members were on the Geraldo show and so on and so forth. And a lot of times how people do things, it's not they just come out and have an open conversation and say, hey man, black people are doing this, immigrants are doing that, this one's doing this. No, they try to break you down with a certain conversation. Be real friendly, be real welcoming and open, so you feel like you could associate with them. So this is how they do things. So sometimes people, you know, things you try to rationalize yourself, you know, and your methodology, and think there's nothing wrong with it, and then you realize how stupid it sounds, especially when you're growing up in a house with biracial siblings, with a black stepfather. This is stupid. So the one thing I always said to myself was, I'm not anti-black. I was anti-immigrant though, without a doubt. I was anti-immigrant. I did not like immigrants. And that's kind of how I reconciled it. I didn't have immigrants in my family, so I didn't have to feel bad about that. But even then, you learn that after time when you meet people and you start talking to people, especially later on in my life. It was stupid, man. It was just stupid. It didn't make any sense. You're hating somebody because they're from another piece of land, disliking somebody because they don't share your national origin. So this is how I reconcile stuff, you know, and I just always felt that I never went the full line of going to be white power or neo-Nazi. And one thing I said years later was I looked at white nationalism. I call it the gateway drug to white power, neo-Nazism. After coming back from New York as well, you know, I didn't just hook up back with my old friends that I grew up with. I started meeting different people, you know, and starting hanging out with different people. Still people that were in the hardcore scene, you know, I had different groups of friends. And then I kind of became to knowing these certain group of individuals. They were a little into foolishness and stuff, more like into fighting, starting fights with people, you know, sometimes, you know, getting high and even like, you know, kind of ripping people off, robbing people and so on and so forth. And, you know, I was never into that sort of thing. I was kind of like a guy who just hung out with them. Sometimes it was comical to me, but then sometimes it got scary situations, you know, that I recall we'd go out to a party and, you know, I'd fall asleep in the car because I was like one of the only workers. I'd work and they'd come back into the car talking about they robbed stuff from the party. Or we go to a party and we get into some beef with some local individuals and we get into a situation, we get chased out of the party, or people we're fighting in the street with people and so on and so forth. But I always kind of try to stay on the outskirts of things. I didn't really want to get into the foolishness. But there was times, you know, you did get into the foolishness. You know, I recall an incident where with some of these guys, and we kind of became like a little crew. That's the whole thing. We became a crew and we called ourselves SIB, the Strong Island Boys. So like we kind of like at the hardcore shows on Long Island, we kind of ran things in a sense. And, you know, people stepped out of line, you know, we had relationships with the bouncers and stuff. They kind of let us do things, you know, even in Florida, we kind of had that sort of thing too, man. We, you know, with some of the, you know, at some of the shows, you kind of, you know, got respect with the people who ran the shows, the bouncers. And we, you know, we beat up people and stuff like that just for no reason. You know, it's like in the movie A Clockwork Orange, for a little bit of the old ultra violence. No reason whatsoever. And so I remember, you know, one incident, we were in front of a club out here on Long Island and we saw this couple arguing. And, you know, we always stuck our nose in business that didn't belong, you know. And so we kind of got involved and the guy was really going hard on his girl. So we kind of jumped him, we started beating him down. And I remember, you know, pulling his hair, you know, and I hear it ripping out, man. It was nasty, man. And then the girl come up to me and she's screaming at me. She goes, man, I got his baby in my stomach, man. I'm like, I cursed her out. I said, I don't care, you know, and so on and so forth. And then, but I kind of felt bad about that, you know. I felt bad. I didn't have no, even when I was agnostic, I always had a sort of a consciousness about myself, you know, feeling bad about doing things, saying things, so on and so forth. And then I remember another incident. We were at a show out in the city, and you know, we're standing out in front of this club, and this friend of ours, he got into a thing with a girl, and he bashed her in the head with a 40-ounce bottle. And that came back to bite us, you know, bite us good, because, you know, her people came out from the city to Long Island, and they basically chased this guy down. But we were like, yo, we ain't got your back on this because you were stupid in what you're doing. But that was a close call. And then there was another close call where we were in a show with my friends, with this crew, man, with this group, you know, you want to call it a gang, whatever. And a guy that we knew who was friends with us, he was getting jumped, so I came and I pulled the guy off, and then next thing you know, my friends came and pummeled him. But see, I didn't get involved, I didn't do nothing, all I did was pull him off. So I come out of the club, and he's standing out there with a leveler in his hand, a metal leveler in his hand, and he's got the look like he want to kill me. So I had a friend there, he kind of talked it out of it, you know, and got me out of there. But that later on that night, those friends who jumped him, man, they got attacked by him, man. He bashed the car windows in, people got glass, they got attacked, you know, they got hurt. But this was the foolishness, and I just couldn't take it no more. I couldn't deal with that, you know. I didn't want to be around people who did stupid things, who getting high, who do, you know, who were robbing people, just starting fights, man. I remember one time we were on the train coming back from, you know, going to the city on the Long Island Railroad. A friend of mine just saw some guy, he just started with him for no reason, just because he looked at him. I wasn't into that. I wasn't into that. I'm not one to fight just to fight, and you know, and I really wasn't always into that. I was, to use a catchphrase, I was a lover, not a fighter. But when I had to, I had to. But that was, you know, that was part of my thing, is getting away from that mentality, getting away from that foolishness, man. So you know, I started hanging out with these guys less and less, and I'm glad I did, because longer down the road, man, some of these guys are dead now. They be in jail. They just lived foolish lives, man, and developed nothing out of themselves. While at the same time I was listening, when I was still in Florida, listening to groups such as Screwdriver, other groups such as Brutal Attack, there was groups called Skullhead, all these, you know, white power bands. The irony of it all was, I was listening to groups like Public Enemy, I was listening to Eric B. and Rakim, I was listening to Big Daddy Kane. And the one thing me and my friends used to say to each other, especially with Public Enemy, they said, man, if I was black, I'd be a Black Panther. That's what we'd say. Because we didn't look at white pride, white nationalism as something bad. You know, we really weren't angry with the fact that black people were showing pride, racial pride. We were just like, okay, if you're doing that, let me do that. But see, the whole thing was, it's dangerous more for white people, because when white people show racial pride, bad things could happen. You know, it starts to drift into superiority. So there is a dangerous line. There's a fine line to cross between being having pride, and leading to hatred. But we should never go to the extreme. And that was the danger in that time with some people. Be it some of the people who are into white pride, be it some people who are into black pride, be it some people you have even into Latino pride. It becomes a thing where it kind of blinds you, it puts blinders on you, where you don't know how to interact with other people sometimes. You know, but that was the thing, and coincidentally enough, that listening to groups like Public Enemy and stuff, that was sort of the stepping stone to my change. And another stepping stone to my change was also when I was in Florida. A friend of mine, another skinhead, we went to the movies and we saw Mississippi Burning. This came out in 88, 89. And it was basically a movie about the FBI search for, you know, civil rights workers in Mississippi. And I remember watching that movie and seeing what these Klansmen were doing to black people, and the fear and all this stuff. And it hurt me. It hurt me. And it kind of like really made me think differently. So that, if I look at a turning point in my life, that was it. And it made me really think differently. I was like, man, you know, these people got racial pride, and look what they're doing. So like I said, when I got back to New York, bit by bit, that ideology started to dissipate. And also because sometimes, unfortunately, you have to be honest, your environment has a lot of effect on you. You become a product of your environment. And so because this ideology was not as acceptable as it was with some realms down in Florida, I had to step away from it. Here I was back with my best friends. You know, some of them were black, some of them were white. I was meeting new people. And, you know, slowly but surely I got out of that. I was still into the hardcore scene. I loved the music. I loved the aggression of, you know, going to shows and slam dancing, stage diving, getting into fights. We loved that. But that whole nationalism thing was starting to go. It was starting to slowly go away. And then really what hit me was, there was a brother named Inshira. He was a friend of the family. He grew up with my stepfather in North Amityville. He was older than my stepfather. His younger brother was my stepfather, one of his best friends. So he would always come by and play chess with him. And he would always come over, have a kufi on, long white thawb, long white Islamic garment, and he just always, you know, real kind, real sweet, always smelled good because he had the oils on, always selling one of the earliest, probably the first oil and incense merchant on Long Island. So he always, you know, I'd known him for years. So I remember he left the Quran for my mother and stepfather, and he was trying to teach them, and he said to me, one time I saw them had it in a certain way, and I was about ready to take it out of the house, but then I cleaned it off and I put it back neatly, and I said, you know, I'll leave it here. And after that, I picked it up and started reading it. But I still didn't understand it. And then I also always saw the Muslims around always getting the respect. Getting respect from the stick-up kids, getting respect from the drug dealers, getting respect from the junkies, getting the crackheads, the pimps, the whores, everybody. They got respect because the Muslims respected themselves. So I admired that. So when you see that did something to you. Like, who are these people? So in around the summer of 1991, after I got this book, The Pale Man, Inshira came over to my house, and he was the imam, the leader of the community in Wyandanch, New York. And I asked him, I said, what is this? I said, I can't be a Muslim. He said, man, this ain't Islam. He said, why don't you do this? Why don't you come at Sunday at 1 o'clock and I'll tell you what Islam is. So started going to this. At first I was nervous. So I would meet him at his house and follow him to the mosque, to the masjid, and sit there, you know, with Muslims, and just sit there kind of feeling shy, feeling kind of weird, and listening to what they were discussing. They were discussing Islam, they were discussing the oneness of God. You know, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the last of a line of prophets and messengers sent to mankind to teach them the oneness of God. You know, that we were taught that, you know, we were learning that God is one without partner, that there's nothing like him, there's nothing equal to him. He has no son, he has no wife, he has no father, he has no mother. He's not born, nor does he give birth. He's nothing like unto him. And this blew my mind, man, because this is what we didn't learn this in Catholicism, in Christianity. We learned Jesus was the Son of God. We learned Jesus in some realms was God incarnate. We learned God had a mother, Mary. This is what we all learned. So this confused me. People talk about Christianity being monotheistic, but here you are talking this and that. But when Islam was being explained to me, it all made sense. Well, just to give a background, you know, even with my family, I'm the oldest of 6 siblings. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers. My mother and stepfather are no longer together. They've been divorced for about 8-9 years. And even with my family, my mother became Muslim a year after I did. Some of my siblings were born into Islam, and 1 or 2 converted. And so that's what I have in that family. And now for myself, I've been married going on 21 years. I have 4 children. I have a son from my first marriage, my ex-wife, and I have a son. I have 2 other sons and a daughter from my marriage now. And I was married a sister who was born and raised in Islam. So there's a beautiful sort of dynamic in that. Is here I am, a convert from the streets, grew up a different way of life, come to Islam, and you have somebody who was born and raised in Islam. So when there's certain things that I understand that she don't, well, I give insight to that. And just as that when she helps me to gives me insight into raising children that were born and raised in Islam. And so like I said, we've been married now going on 21 years, and we have a happy marriage. And this is another one of the great blessings that Allah has given me through Islam, because that was another thing. I was never a long-term relationship like that, because it was just be with this one, leave, be with this one, leave. And then, Islam taught me you have to be dedicated, you have to be respectful, you have to treat women, with respect and kindness and love, especially somebody who's a believing woman, a woman who goes and puts herself on the front line, a woman who goes and who dresses in the ways that pleases the Creator, and it has modesty and helps raise your children. That's very important. So I'm blessed that way. Well, Islam puts that stuff in check. When you have traits about yourself that you've always had, you learn to put it in check. Whereas if you, like for example, I haven't been to any sort of show in 20 plus years. And there's times that I want to do it. I hear a band that I used to like coming back together or this, and I want to go see it. But then I remember to myself, what would happen if I die in that state? So it gives me, this is what we call in Islam taqwa, the consciousness, the fear of Allah, is that you fear of offending Allah. You fear of doing the wrong to offend Allah. And so when I have that thing where I want to do something, it's put in check. This is the consciousness. So I don't go and do it. For the youth, is be yourself. Well, it sounds cliche, but be yourself. Problem with the youth today, and it's not just the problem with the youth today, it was the problem with the youth of my time as well. Everybody wants to be like on a conveyor belt, like they come out of production. Everybody looks the same, everybody talks the same, everybody acts the same. They have no individuality. Even in Islam, the one thing that I learned prior to being a Muslim is to appreciate my individuality. I dress the way I do. I keep it with an Islamic flavor, but I keep it in a way that's unique to me alone. I don't have to. You have to be people who don't succumb to the pressures of this society. They want you to be on drugs. They want you to engage in drinking alcohol. They want you to commit premarital, get involved in premarital sex, have children out of wedlock. These are things that are destroying our society. You got people who we're all on this one boat together, but you got people who are drilling holes all into the bottom of the boat, and we're sinking. And when we sink together. We have to be consciousness. There's a lack of consciousness of the Creator. We cannot be stupid enough to believe that we are all here by accident. That there's not a Creator. There's not as we as Muslims say, Allah, who's controlling everything, who has the full and utmost power. There's nothing wrong with that. See, and also we are living in a society that's telling you to do whatever you want to do. It's hedonistic. So we're going down a dangerous, dark road where you see you know, the whole homosexuality agenda being pushed, shoved down people's throats. And it's going to only lead to another agenda, slowly but surely. And so we have to be people of God consciousness. We have to be people of morality. We have to be people of that are awake and see what's going on. And to fear none except the Creator.